I woke up from an 11-hour spinal fusion surgery entirely alone. The anesthesia was barely wearing off when I checked my phone and found 63 missed calls. But it was the single voicemail from my mother, Yvonne, that froze the blood in my veins. Her voice was casually upbeat as she explained that she and my father, Derek, had used my medical power of attorney to sign over the deed to my luxury Atlanta condo. They sold it for a fraction of its value, just $355,000 to pay for my younger sister Brianna and her fancy white fiancé Preston to have the wedding of the century. "You were sleeping so soundly," she chirped, "so we just handled the paperwork for you. The wedding is in 2 weeks, and we cannot look bad in front of Preston and his rich family. They thought I would just cry and accept it." What they completely forgot is that I am a senior forensic financial auditor who tracks down shell companies for a living. I investigate criminals who try to hide their stolen assets in offshore bank accounts, and I am very good at my job. Let me tell you what happened next. The pain in my back was a blinding white-hot sensation that radiated down my legs, but it was nothing compared to the shock of hearing my mother confess to federal fraud. The sterile smell of the hospital room made me nauseous. I shifted against the stiff mattress, gritting my teeth against the fresh incision running down my spine. As my hand trembled, reaching for water, the night nurse walked in. "You are finally awake," she said, checking the monitors. "I was surprised your parents left so quickly yesterday. They stayed for exactly 5 minutes to get the doctor to sign a form confirming you were heavily sedated, then rushed out for a dress fitting." The audacity made me laugh, a dry, rasping sound. A dress fitting. My parents, Yvonne and Derek, were pillars of their Atlanta megachurch. To them, image was everything, and my sister Brianna was their golden calf. I pulled my laptop from my overnight bag, wincing as the movement pulled at my stitches. The nurse stepped forward, looking alarmed, advising me to rest, but I shook my head. "I cannot rest," I told her, my fingers flying across the keyboard. "My parents just stole my house. They did the exact same thing when I was 19, draining my college savings account to pay for Brianna and her sweet 16 party. I survived it then, but I was no longer a helpless college student." The screen loaded and the reality of their crime stared back at me. My property, a beautiful loft I had spent years paying off, was officially listed as sold. The transfer documents had been pushed through using the emergency medical directive. The buyer was Apex Holdings, a private entity that paid $355,000 in cash. My property was appraised at $750,000. I accessed my firm's software utilizing the forensic auditing tools I used every day to track down corporate embezzlers. It took me less than 3 minutes to follow the money trail. The cash had been wired directly into a joint checking account under Brianna and Preston. Preston was my future brother-in-law. He loved to boast about his old money pedigree, constantly looking down his nose at us, dropping subtle racist remarks wrapped in polite Southern charm. My parents practically worshipped the ground he walked on, convinced that marrying into his white aristocratic family would elevate their social standing in the church. They bent over backward to accommodate his every whim, desperate to prove we belonged in his world. And now, they had literally stolen the roof over my head to fund a wedding reception designed to impress his relatives. I clicked through the transaction history of the joint wedding account. Within the last 12 hours, thousands of dollars had already been hemorrhaged. $10,000 to a luxury floral designer, $15,000 to an exclusive catering company, $5,000 for imported champagne. My mother had always viewed my independence as an insult to her traditional values. She hated that I chose building my career over finding a husband, and she saw my assets as a communal family pot ready to be raided whenever Brianna batted her eyelashes. I stared at the remaining balance. The anger that had been simmering inside me for 31 years finally boiled over, solidifying into pure cold calculation. I opened the federal banking portal reserved for certified fraud examiners. I drafted a comprehensive suspicious activity report, citing unauthorized use of a medical power of attorney wire fraud and illegal real estate transfer. With one steady press of the enter key, I initiated a hard freeze on the joint wedding account. The federal alert system immediately locked down every single cent. The funds were now completely inaccessible pending a federal investigation. I closed the laptop, letting the satisfaction wash over me despite the throbbing pain in my spine. Less than 2 minutes later, my phone began to vibrate violently against the plastic tray table. The caller ID flashed with Brianna's name. I let it ring 3 times before calmly swiping to answer, placing the phone on speaker. Her voice came through as a high-pitched, hysterical shriek echoing off the sterile walls. "Why did my card just decline at the bridal boutique?" she screamed. "The manager is looking at me like I am a criminal, and they are threatening to cancel the custom veil. My card says the account is frozen due to suspected fraud." "What did you do?" I leaned back, adjusting my back brace. The pain medication was finally kicking in, but the real relief came from her absolute panic. "I did exactly what an auditor does, Brianna," I said, my voice dangerously steady. "I found the stolen money and secured it. You and Mom thought you could sell my foundation to pay for your party." I smiled, listening to her hyperventilating on the other line. "You better tell the boutique to put that veil back on the rack, little sister, because your card is not going to work today, tomorrow, or ever again. And trust me, this is just the beginning." The plastic phone receiver was still warm in my hand when the heavy wooden door to my recovery room flew open, hitting the wall with a loud thud. The adrenaline from locking down the $355,000 was already starting to fade, leaving me acutely aware of the throbbing titanium screws freshly fused into my spine. I could not turn my head because of the rigid cervical brace encasing my neck and chest, but I did not need to see them to know who had just barged in. The sharp scent of my mother's expensive gardenia perfume mixed with my father. Heavy cologne preceded them like a storm front. "Sydney, unlock that account right now," my mother Yvonne demanded. She marched into my line of sight, clutching a designer handbag so tightly her knuckles were ashen. She was wearing her Sunday best, a tailored navy suit with pearls, clearly having just come from a luncheon with the church elders. My father Derek shadowed her, his face twisted in a scowl that he usually reserved for unruly employees at his car dealership. I looked up at them, fighting the urge to press the morphine drip button. "You forged my signature on a medical power of attorney." "Mom," I said, my voice raspy but calm. "You bypassed federal banking protocols to sell a luxury property you do not own." "We did not forge anything," my father snapped, stepping closer to the bed and towering over my immobilized body. "You signed a blanket medical directive before you went under anesthesia. We are your parents. We simply used our legal authority to make a financial decision for the good of this family. You were asleep. The house was just sitting there empty." "It was sitting there empty because I was in a surgical ward getting my spine rebuilt," I replied, refusing to break eye contact. "And selling my home at a $400,000 loss to fund a wedding reception is not a medical necessity. It is a felony." My mother let out a loud scoff, crossing her arms over her chest. "Do not you dare talk to us about felonies," she hissed, leaning over the bed rail. "You owe this family. Do you have any idea what is at stake here?" "Preston parents are flying in from Martha Vineyard this weekend. His family has real wealth, generational wealth. We cannot look like poor ghetto folks in front of them." I stared at the woman who had birthed me, listening to her weaponize her own internalized racism to justify destroying my life. She and my father had spent decades climbing the social ladder at our Atlanta megachurch, the ultimate black elite. Brianna landing a wealthy white fiancé was their crowning achievement. They viewed Preston as a trophy that proved they had finally made it to the top. "You are being incredibly selfish, Sydney," my father interjected. "You have always been jealous of your sister. Just because no man wants to deal with a workaholic accountant does not mean you get to ruin her special day. Unfreeze the money. The wedding planner is threatening to cancel the caterer." "I cannot unfreeze it," I lied smoothly, relying on my training interrogating hostile executives. Federal fraud alerts trigger an automatic 72-hour hold. The IRS and the Banking Commission are already reviewing the wire transfer. My mother gasped, taking a step back as her manicured hand flew to her chest. The IRS, Sydney. You fix this. You call them and tell them it was a misunderstanding. What will the pastor say if investigators start calling the church? They will think you are exactly what you are, I said, keeping my breathing even despite the sharp shooting pain radiating down my left leg. Criminals who preyed on their own daughter while she was unconscious. My father's face darkened with absolute fury. He reached into the breast pocket of his suit and pulled out a thick folded stack of legal documents. He threw them violently onto my lap where they landed heavily against my surgical brace. You think you are so smart with your little numbers and your spreadsheets, he snarled. You have no leverage here, Sydney. The wire transfer might be paused, but the sale is already finalized. So unless you want to sleep on the streets in that wheelchair, you will pick up that phone and clear the funds. I slowly lowered my gaze to the documents resting on my chest. My hands were trembling slightly from the physical trauma of the surgery, but my mind was operating with crystal clarity. I pushed the top page aside with my index finger scanning the settlement statement. I needed to know who had bought my $750,000 home for less than half its value in cash. My eyes locked onto the buyer information listed on the second page. The property had not been sold to an individual. It had been transferred to a corporate entity named Apex Holdings Limited Liability Company. The room seemed to go entirely silent except for the rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor. I did not just recognize the name of the company, I recognized the specific legal structuring of the shell corporation. I had seen this exact same corporate structure just 2 months ago when I was auditing a shady real estate developer for my firm. I traced the routing numbers and the registered agent's signature at the bottom of the page. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying precision. My parents had not just found a random buyer looking for a quick deal, they had been guided into this transaction. I looked back up at my parents who were watching me with triumphant expressions, thinking they had just delivered the ultimate checkmate. They honestly believed they were the masterminds of this operation, securing their social status and funding their golden child dream wedding. They had no idea they were just pawns who were being sacrificed to feed Preston greed. They smiled at me, completely unaware that the man they worshipped was setting them up to take the fall for federal fraud, leaving them with absolutely nothing at all. A slow, cold realization washed over me, numbing the physical pain in my back. My parents had not just stolen from me, they had walked blindly into a trap set by the very man they were trying to impress. Preston was not the wealthy savior they worshipped. He was a calculated predator, and he was about to learn how ruthlessly I fought back. I stared at the name, Apex Holdings Limited Liability Company, on the documents my father had violently thrown at my chest. The pain medication was making the edges of my vision blur, but my mind had never been sharper. My parents had stormed out of the hospital room, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the heart monitor and the reality of their betrayal. I pushed the call button for the nurse and asked for my work tablet from my overnight bag. When she hesitated, looking at my rigid cervical collar and spinal brace, I told her I needed it to process my medical insurance claims. It was a lie, but she handed it over with a sympathetic nod before quietly slipping out of the room. I balanced the tablet on my stomach, wincing as the movement pulled at the fresh titanium screws fused into my spine. I logged into my firm proprietary auditing database via the secure virtual private network. As a senior forensic financial auditor, I had security clearance levels that most federal field agents dreamed of having. I bypassed the standard corporate registries that anyone could access online and went straight into the deep-tier search tools our firm used to pierce the corporate veil of embezzlers and tax evaders. Apex Holdings was registered in Delaware, a state notorious for shielding the identities of corporate owners through strict privacy laws. But whoever set this up had made a sloppy, arrogant mistake. The registered agent listed on the incorporation documents was a small boutique law firm in downtown Atlanta. I cross-referenced that specific law firm client list with the wire transfer routing numbers my parents had used to sell my home. The screen populated with a complex web of dummy corporations and blind trusts. It took me 45 minutes of agonizing typing through the blinding pain in my back, but I finally cracked the primary holding account. The principal beneficiary and sole managing member of Apex Holdings was Preston Sterling, the man my parents thought was going to permanently elevate our family into the black elite. Was the exact same man who had just orchestrated the theft of my $750,000 home. He had bought it for $355,000, using my desperate socially climbing parents as his unwitting accomplices. I reached for my phone and dialed the direct line for Marcus Vance, the lead counsel at my accounting firm. It was late in the evening, but Marcus answered on the second ring. I did not bother with pleasantries or explaining my medical condition. I told him straight out that my parents had just committed federal title fraud using a forged medical power of attorney while I was completely sedated under anesthesia. Marcus was dead silent for a long moment before asking what exactly I needed him to do. I told him I needed him to flag a specific Delaware shell corporation for immediate federal review. I explained that my future brother-in-law had manipulated two desperate black parents into committing a federal crime so he could buy my condo for pennies on the dollar. Marcus asked the most logical question an attorney could ask. He wanted to know where Preston got the $355,000 in cash to initiate the wire transfer in the first place. That was the exact question I was currently answering as I ran Preston's social security number through our alternate financial databases. Preston and his family paraded around Martha Vineyard and the Atlanta Country Club, acting like they owned the world. My parents practically bowed when they spoke about his family lineage, telling everyone in our megachurch that Brianna was marrying into old money. They constantly threw his imagined wealth in my face, telling me that my accounting career was nothing compared to generational wealth. But the raw data scrolling across my tablet screen told a completely different story. Preston was not old money. Preston was absolutely no money. He had zero significant assets to his name. The trust fund he constantly bragged about had been completely depleted 3 years ago by bad investments and a severe gambling problem. His premium credit cards were all maxed out to their absolute limits, and he had 2 different luxury vehicles currently in the active process of being repossessed by the bank. The $355,000 he used to buy my stolen condo did not come from a family vault or a wealthy uncle. I traced the origin of the wire transfer back through 3 different offshore shell accounts until I finally hit the original source. It was a high-yield hard money loan originating from an unlicensed lending entity out of Macau. Preston had borrowed the money from a literal international loan shark. I dug deeper into the Macau routing numbers, tracing the exact flow of the collateralized loan. Preston had orchestrated a back-to-back closing. The moment my father forged my signature and transferred the deed to Apex Holdings, Preston immediately pledged that same deed to the offshore lender. The Macau entity released $700,000 into a newly established Cayman account, controlled exclusively by Preston. He used half of that money to pay my parents the $355,000 for the fraudulent purchase, creating the illusion of a legitimate cash transaction. My parents then turned around and dumped that stolen cash directly into the joint wedding account. It was a classic circular money laundering technique designed to wash the funds while leaving my parents holding the smoking gun. If the federal government audited the trail, my parents would be charged with title fraud and wire fraud, while Preston walked away clean with the remaining offshore cash. But why would a dangerous offshore lender give a broke, unemployed man over $300,000 in liquid cash? The answer was sitting right in front of me on the paperwork my father had left behind. I pulled the property deed transfer document and looked closely at the encumbrances and liens section. Preston had not just bought my condo to live in it or to help my sister. Within 2 hours of the title transferring from my name to Apex Holdings, he had taken out a secondary collateralized loan against the property true market value of $750,000. He was using my stolen home as hard collateral to secure a massive illegal offshore loan to pay off his existing mountain of hidden debt. He knew my parents were so blinded by their desperate need for social validation that they would do whatever it took to fund the wedding. He played on their respectability politics, convincing them that they had to sell my condo quickly and quietly to save face in front of his wealthy relatives. But those wealthy relatives were just as broke as he was. The entire wedding my parents were sacrificing my life and my home to fund was nothing but a brilliant, calculated smokescreen. Preston was a desperate man drowning in debt and looking down the barrel of a loan shark, crosshairs. He found the perfect mark in Brianna, and the perfect accomplices in my image-obsessed parents. They handed him my sanctuary on a silver platter, thinking they were buying their way into high society. Instead, they had forged federal documents for a con artist who was about to let them take the fall for everything. I locked the tablet screen and stared up at the sterile ceiling of the hospital room. The physical pain in my spine was completely eclipsed by a deep, simmering sense of triumph. They thought I was just the bitter older sister, but they forgot that I uncover financial ruin for a living. The trap was set, and I was about to pull the lever. The hospital discharged me 48 hours later. My doctor was reluctant to let me leave so soon after a major spinal fusion, but I was absolutely relentless. A physical therapist strapped me into a rigid, custom-molded back brace and handed me a heavy metal cane to help distribute my weight. Every single step I took sent a blinding shockwave of agony straight up my spine and down my legs, but my mind was completely detached from the physical pain. I was operating purely on adrenaline and cold, calculating rage. I ordered a standard private medical transport to take me back to my luxury loft. I needed to see the crime scene with my own eyes. The drive through the Atlanta traffic felt like it took hours. When the transport van finally pulled up to my exclusive building, the driver offered to walk me up to my door, but I declined. I wanted to handle this alone. I gripped the heavy wooden handle of my cane and limped into the elevator, scanning my key fob to access the private top floor. My loft was my sanctuary. I had spent 6 years designing every single square inch of it, using my hard-earned auditor bonuses to create a quiet, peaceful oasis away from my family and their chaotic social climbing church drama. I reached my front door and slid my key into the deadbolt. It did not turn. I pushed the heavy metal key harder, but the lock was completely jammed. I looked closer and noticed tiny fresh metal shavings scattered on the welcome mat. The brass plate around the lock had deep, ugly scratch marks. The entire locking mechanism had been completely drilled out and replaced with a cheap hardware store deadbolt. Before I could even process the violation, the heavy oak door swung inward. Preston stood in the doorway holding a crystal tumbler filled with expensive bourbon that he had undoubtedly stolen from my private liquor cabinet. He was wearing his signature pastel polo shirt and imported loafers, looking every bit the wealthy white aristocrat my parents desperately wanted him to be. But looking at him now, I did not see a wealthy heir. I saw a pathetic, broke, desperate con artist who had borrowed money from a foreign crime syndicate just to keep up appearances. "Look who decided to show up," he sneered, leaning against the doorframe to block my view. He took a slow, arrogant sip of my bourbon. "You look terrible, Sydney. I guess the surgery did not fix your miserable disposition." I leaned heavily on my cane, looking past his shoulder into my home. The violation was immediate and nauseating. My custom velvet sofa had been shoved into a corner to make room for a tacky, oversized leather recliner. His cheap, muddy golf clubs were dumped carelessly against my pristine white walls, leaving dark scuff marks on the paint. Several boxes belonging to Brianna were already stacked in my dining room. They were actively moving into the home they had stolen from me. "Step aside, Preston," I said, my voice low and dangerously calm. "This is my property and I need to pack my medical supplies." Preston laughed, a loud, grating sound that echoed down the quiet hallway. He took a step forward, invading my personal space, forcing me to grip my cane tighter to keep my balance. "You do not own anything here anymore, Sydney. Your parents practically gave this place to me." Derek signed the papers himself. "They told me you were too focused on your boring little accounting job to appreciate a home like this anyway." He stepped closer, dropping his voice into a vicious, mocking whisper. They know Brianna deserves better than you ever will. Your mother begged me to take this place off your hands so she would not have to worry about looking like poor ghetto folks when my parents fly in from Martha Vineyard for the wedding. She said you owe this family for raising you. I stared into his pale, watery eyes, listening to him weaponize my mother's deep-seated inferiority complex. My parents were so blinded by respectability politics and their desperate need for white validation that they handed my entire life over to a criminal. Preston puffed out his chest, looking down at my back brace and my cane. Now you need to turn around and leave, he ordered, gesturing toward the elevator with his empty glass. If you step 1 foot inside my home, I am going to call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. I am sure your parents will gladly testify that you are mentally unstable and harassing us. A lesser woman would have screamed. A lesser woman would have raised her cane and struck him right across his smug, arrogant face. But I am a forensic financial auditor. I know that arguing with a man who owes over $500,000 to a Macau loan shark is a complete waste of my breath. The FBI would be dealing with Preston soon enough, and I did not want to leave any trace of a domestic dispute that his lawyers could use to distract from his federal crimes. I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear. I simply looked at him with absolute dead-eyed indifference, turned around and limped slowly back toward the elevator. I heard him laugh again as he slammed my own front door behind me, locking me out of my own life. As the elevator doors closed, I pulled my phone from my pocket. My parents and Preston thought they had left me completely destitute. They thought because I drove a sensible car and did not flaunt designer labels at church every Sunday that my condo was my only real asset. They constantly mistook my quiet modesty for financial struggle. What they did not know was that I routinely earned massive corporate bonuses for uncovering multi-million-dollar embezzlement schemes. I opened my private wealth management application on my phone. The screen loaded, displaying my liquid assets spread across several high-yield investment portfolios and quiet offshore holding accounts. I had over $4 million sitting perfectly untouched. I did not need to call a friend to crash on their couch. I did not need to beg my parents for a room. I opened a luxury concierge application and tapped the screen exactly 3 times. I requested a private black car service and booked the top-floor presidential penthouse suite at the most exclusive 5-star hotel in downtown Atlanta. The nightly rate was exorbitant, but I wanted the absolute highest level of security and comfort, while my spine healed and my trap snapped shut. The black car was waiting at the curb the moment I exited my building. The driver, an older gentleman in an immaculate dark suit, immediately rushed forward to take my hospital bag. He gently assisted me into the spacious leather interior, treating me with the exact dignity my own family had just denied me. I sank back into the heated seats, watching my stolen condo building disappear in the tinted window. The hotel staff was waiting for me when we arrived at the grand entrance. They escorted me directly to the private penthouse elevator, completely bypassing the public lobby. The suite was breathtaking, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glittering Atlanta skyline, a massive soaking tub, and a custom king-sized bed that looked like a cloud. I slowly lowered my battered, aching body onto the pristine white mattress, letting out a long, slow breath. I was safe. I was wealthy. And I was holding every single card. Just as I closed my eyes to finally rest, my phone chimed loudly from the bedside table. It was a new email notification. I reached over and picked it up. It was a digital invitation to the official wedding rehearsal dinner scheduled for tomorrow night at the most exclusive country club in the city. But it was not just a generic invitation. Attached to the bottom of the elegant digital stationery was a personal typed note from Brianna. I read the words twice, feeling the cold, familiar sting of my sister, endless cruelty. The note was brief, but it carried the weight of our entire toxic childhood. It read, "Do not even bother coming to the dinner, Sydney. You will just bring your negative energy and embarrass Preston family with your bad attitude. Stay away from my perfect weekend." I stared at the glowing screen, reading the word perfect over and over again. My sister thought she was marrying a prince. She thought she had finally beaten me, completely destroying my life to buy her way into high society. I locked my phone and set it back on the nightstand, a small, dangerous smile spreading across my face. I was definitely going to that rehearsal dinner, and I was going to wear my finest dress. The pain in my spine was a constant throbbing drumbeat, but it only sharpened my focus. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my penthouse suite, carefully stepping into a custom emerald green silk gown. It was the most expensive piece of clothing I owned, bought with my very first senior auditor bonus. The deep jewel tone contrasted sharply with the heavy metal medical cane I now needed to support my weight. My reflection showed a woman who was physically broken, but mentally untouchable. I carefully adjusted my rigid back brace, hiding its bulky outline beneath a matching silk shawl. My sister thought a petty digital invitation and a nasty note would keep me away. She thought my stolen condo would leave me crying in a motel room. She had no idea that I was about to walk into her fairy tale and light a match. My private car arrived at the Buckhead Grand Country Club just after 7 in the evening. The venue was a sprawling antebellum-style mansion dripping in old Southern money and exclusionary prestige. It was exactly the kind of place my parents had spent their entire lives trying to gain access to. The valet rushed forward to open my door, taking note of my expensive gown before his eyes dropped to my medical cane. I handed him a $50 bill and began the excruciatingly slow walk up the marble steps. Every movement sent a sharp flare of nerve pain down my legs, but I kept my posture perfectly straight. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me hobble. The grand ballroom was a sea of crystal chandeliers and imported white roses. Waiters in crisp tuxedos floated through the crowd, carrying silver trays of hors d'oeuvres and vintage champagne. I paused in the grand archway, taking in the scene. My parents were standing near the center of the room, surrounded by Preston relatives. They looked painfully desperate to belong, laughing too loudly at jokes that were not funny and nodding eagerly at people who were clearly looking down on them. My sister Brianna was clinging to Preston's arm, wearing a white cocktail dress that probably cost more than my first car. They looked like the perfect picture of blended high society. It did not take long for the illusion to crack. Preston mother Eleanor Sterling spotted me from across the room. She was a thin, brittle woman draped in diamonds that were paid for by my stolen equity. She excused herself from my parents and glided toward me with a predatory smile on her heavily lifted face. Her eyes swept over my emerald gown and the heavy metal cane tight lines forming around her mouth. She stopped a few feet away, keeping a deliberate physical distance, as if my presence might somehow contaminate her. "Sydney, dear," she purred, her voice laced with that specific type of wealthy Southern condescension. "We honestly did not expect you to show up. Preston told me about your unfortunate financial situation. It is just so tragic when young women try to live beyond their means and end up losing everything." I leaned on my cane, feeling the cold metal ground me. "I did not lose everything, Mrs. Sterling," I said, keeping my voice low and pleasant. "My assets were illegally transferred while I was in a surgical ward." She let out a soft, breathy laugh, waving her hand as if swatting away a fly. "Well, you know how paperwork can be confusing for people without proper financial literacy. We are just so proud of Preston for stepping in and buying your little apartment. It is so sweet of him to help your parents out. They were so worried about you becoming a burden to them. It must be difficult for your family coming from such humble beginnings to understand how real wealth is managed." She leaned in closer, dropping her voice. "We admire your parents for trying so hard to fit in tonight. They are doing their absolute best to be presentable." The blatant microaggressions hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She was looking right through me, viewing my black family as nothing more than a charity project for her white son to manage. She actually thought my stolen home was a favor. She had no idea that her son was completely broke and leveraging that same stolen home to pay off illegal gambling debts. Before I could respond to her blatant racism, the atmosphere to my left shifted violently. My mother had finally noticed me standing by the archway. Yvonne marched across the ballroom floor, her heels clicking furiously against the polished hardwood. Her face was contorted in a mask of absolute panic and rage. She completely ignored Mrs. Sterling pushing past her to grab my left arm. Her manicured fingers dug into my biceps so hard I could feel the immediate blooming of a bruise. She leaned into my ear, her voice a venomous hiss. "What are you doing here, Sydney? You always ruin everything. Stop making us look bad in front of the in-laws. I told you to stay away." The sheer physical force she used sent a terrifying spike of pain directly into my healing spine. My legs threatened to give out, but I locked my knees, staring down at the woman who had sold my sanctuary. My mother had spent my entire childhood treating me like an embarrassment because I would not play her shallow games of respectability. She wanted a daughter who would marry a rich man and join the country club. Instead, she got an auditor who saw through every fake smile and forged document. She was willing to physically assault a woman recovering from spinal fusion just to make sure she did not embarrass a room full of white strangers who secretly despised her. I looked from my mother's desperate, angry face to Mrs. Sterling's smug, condescending smile. They were both so wrapped up in their own delusions of grandeur that they could not see the massive federal axe swinging directly toward their necks. The anger that had been simmering inside me evaporated, replaced by a profound, chilling calm. I was done being the dutiful daughter. I was done keeping the peace. I flexed my arm, breaking my mother's iron grip with a swift, calculated movement. Yvonne stumbled back, a look of pure shock crossing her face. She opened her mouth to scold me again, but I simply turned my back on her entirely. I shifted my weight onto my cane and walked slowly toward a passing waiter. I reached out and lifted a crystal flute of expensive champagne from his silver tray. The bubbles danced in the warm light of the chandeliers. I turned back and walked directly up to Preston's mother, closing the deliberate distance she had placed between us. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Conversations around us faltered as guests noticed the confrontation. I held the crystal flute out, offering it to the woman who had just insulted my intelligence and my family. She looked confused, but she reflexively reached out to take the glass. I did not let go right away. I held her gaze, letting my professional mask drop to reveal the ruthless auditor underneath. "I would be careful drinking that, Mrs. Sterling," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the soft classical music playing in the background. "The Internal Revenue Service is very particular about champagne bought with laundered money." The crystal flute slipped from Eleanor Sterling, manicured fingers crashing onto the polished hardwood floor in a shower of expensive champagne and shattered glass. The sharp noise echoed through the grand ballroom, but I did not stay to watch her face drain of color or hear her stumble over her words. I turned my back on her and my mother, using my heavy metal cane to navigate through the sea of shocked guests. The double doors of the banquet room swung shut behind me, cutting off the classical music and the sudden frantic murmurs of the Atlanta elite. The hallway outside was wide and lined with velvet chairs and antique mirrors. The silence was a welcome relief, but the physical exertion of the confrontation was taking a heavy toll on my freshly fused spine. I leaned against the cool silk wallpaper, trying to catch my breath and manage the sharp spikes of agony radiating down my legs. The green silk of my gown felt heavy against my rigid back brace. I knew my dramatic exit would not go unanswered. It only took 30 seconds before the heavy ballroom doors burst open again, hitting the wall with a violent thud that rattled the nearby paintings. Preston stormed into the hallway, his face flushed a deep, ugly red. The charming Southern gentleman facade he wore so carefully was completely gone, replaced by the panicked rage of a cornered animal. He marched toward me, closing the distance with heavy, aggressive strides that echoed sharply against the marble floor. He stopped just inches from my face, trapping me between his broad shoulders and the wall. He was breathing heavily, smelling of stale bourbon and expensive cologne. His eyes darted up and down the empty corridor, ensuring there were no witnesses to his dropping mask. "You think you are so clever, Sydney?" he hissed, his voice trembling with fury. You think you can just waltz in here in a wheelchair and throw around big words like money laundering to scare my mother? I did not flinch, despite the intimidating way he loomed over me. I gripped my cane and looked at him with bored indifference. I did not have to scare your mother, Preston, I said evenly. The federal government will do that for me once they trace the wire transfers from Macau to your hidden Cayman accounts. Preston's jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. He leaned in closer, his pale eyes wide and manic. You are completely out of your mind, he spat. The spinal surgery must have fried your brain. In fact, I think the pain medication is making you hallucinate. I am going to call the local police right now and have them place you on a mandatory psychiatric hold. You are clearly a danger to yourself and others. He smiled a cruel, twisted smile that made my stomach turn. And do you know who is going to back me up, Sydney? Your own mother and father. They will tell the doctors that you have always been mentally unstable. They will sign whatever affidavits my lawyers draft, stating that you have been acting erratic and paranoid since your surgery. They will have you locked in a padded room before the rehearsal dinner is even over. He was banking on the fact that my parents were so desperate to secure this wedding that they would literally lock their own daughter in a psychiatric ward just to keep his secrets safe. The sick part was that he was probably right. My parents had already forged federal documents and sold my home while I was unconscious. Committing me to a hospital to silence me would just be the next logical step in their desperate social climbing sickness. They would do anything to protect the Sterling family name. I let my shoulders slump forward slightly, allowing the heavy weight of my physical pain and my emotional exhaustion to show on my face. I forced my lower lip to tremble and let a few hot tears spill over my eyelashes. I dropped my gaze to the floor, looking exactly like the broken, defeated older sister he always believed I was. I let out a pathetic-sounding sob, letting my cane wobble slightly. "Why are you doing this?" Preston, I asked, my voice cracking perfectly. "Why would you destroy my life like this? My parents gave you everything. They worship you." Preston laughed a dark, victorious sound. He bought the performance completely. His ego was so massive that he could not resist the opportunity to gloat over someone he considered beneath him. He took a step back, crossing his arms over his chest like a proud conqueror admiring his handiwork. "They practically gave the condo to me, Sydney." He mocked, shaking his head. "It was almost too easy. They were so terrified that my family would cancel the wedding if they found out Brianna came from a working-class background. I just had to plant the seed. I told Derek that my father was demanding to see a portfolio of their family assets before he would sign off on the marriage. I told them they needed liquid cash immediately to prove they belonged in our circle." I sniffled, wiping a tear from my cheek with a trembling hand. "But how did you get them to forge the medical directive?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "My father would never take that kind of legal risk for anyone," Preston scoffed, leaning closer to look down at my tear-stained face. "Your father is a weak, desperate man, Sydney. They chose me over you because I promised them the one thing you never could give them: status. When I told Derek the wedding was off unless he secured that property, he panicked. I brought the forged power of attorney documents directly to the hospital waiting room. I stood right over him and told him to sign your name while you were busy getting your spine sliced open. He hesitated for maybe 2 seconds before your mother told him to just do it for Brianna. They handed me the pen and sold you out without a second thought. They are pathetic." He smiled down at me, his eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. "They know Brianna deserves better than you ever will, Sydney. And now I have a $750,000 property, and they have nothing but a fake wedding to look forward to. You have no proof, and you have no family left. You are completely alone." I stood perfectly still, letting his words hang in the quiet hallway. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs. The trembling in my shoulders stopped entirely. I slowly raised my head and looked Preston dead in the eye. The tears were completely gone from my face, leaving behind a cold, ruthless stare that made his smug smile falter. I reached up with my free hand and casually tapped the center of the large diamond brooch pinned to the collar of my emerald silk gown. The center stone was not actually a diamond at all, but a high-grade directional microphone disguised as fine jewelry. It was a piece of specialized equipment issued exclusively to senior forensic auditors working in tandem with federal field offices. I let a slow, genuine smile spread across my face as I watched the realization slowly dawn in his panicked eyes. "Thank you for the confession, Preston," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the empty hallway. "The FBI Financial Crimes Division is listening live." Preston stared at the diamond brooch resting against my collarbone, and the remaining color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost under the soft hallway lights. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish suffocating on dry land. The arrogant smirk that had been plastered across his features just moments ago completely dissolved into raw, unfiltered terror. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping into the antique mirror hanging on the silk wallpaper. The realization of what he had just done hit him with the force of a freight train. He had just openly admitted to coercing my parents into forging a federal document and admitted to leveraging a stolen property for a fraudulent international loan. He looked wildly around the empty corridor, as if expecting federal agents to step out from behind the velvet chairs and tackle him to the marble floor. Without saying another word, he turned and sprinted back toward the heavy doors of the grand ballroom, leaving me alone in the quiet hallway. I stood there for a moment, leaning my weight against the cold metal of my medical cane. The sharp, throbbing pain in my spine was still there, but it was entirely manageable now, heavily muted by the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I did not need to chase him. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was running straight to my parents to spin a web of desperate lies before the federal authorities could close in. I slowly turned around and began the agonizing walk back toward the grand entrance of the country club. Every step sent a fresh wave of agony radiating through my healing nerves, but I kept my head held high. The humid Atlanta night air hit my face as I stepped out onto the massive stone portico. I handed my ticket to the valet and stood near the edge of the driveway waiting for my private black car to navigate up the winding entrance path. I did not have to wait long for the inevitable explosion. The heavy wooden doors of the country club burst open behind me. My father and mother stormed out onto the portico, their faces twisted into identical masks of fury and panic. Preston was hovering safely behind them, letting my parents act as his human shields. He had clearly spun a frantic narrative portraying me as a vindictive, unstable sister who had gone rogue and hacked into federal databases just to frame him and ruin my sister-perfect wedding. Yvonne marched right up to me, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath in the thick evening humidity. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "You are trying to destroy this family," my mother hissed, her voice vibrating with a panicked rage. "Preston just told us what you did in the hallway. He told us you are wearing a wire and threatening to send us all to federal prison over a simple real estate transaction. You are completely sick in the head, Sydney. You are so jealous of Brianna and her happiness that you would literally tear your own parents down just to stop a wedding." I looked at her frantic, desperate face and felt absolutely nothing. There was no sadness left inside me, only a cold, clinical understanding of how deeply broken my parents truly were. They were staring down the barrel of federal wire fraud, and their only instinct was to protect the man who had set them up to take the fall. My father stepped forward, pushing my mother slightly aside so he could loom over me. Derek's face was purple with suppressed rage, and the veins in his neck were visibly pulsing. He looked down at my back brace and my cane with absolute disgust. "You listen to me very carefully, Sydney," he growled, keeping his voice low so the valet standing nearby could not hear. "You have no proof of anything. You have no power here. If you do not call off whatever insane vendetta you are running against Preston, I will make sure you lose everything you have left. I will call the senior partners at your accounting firm first thing tomorrow morning. I will tell them that you embezzled family funds to pay for your spinal surgery. I will tell them you are a thief and a liar, and I will make sure you never work in the financial sector again. I stared at my father, listening to him eagerly threaten my entire livelihood to protect a criminal. The sick irony was that he was not making an empty threat. He had used this exact same playbook against me before. The memories rushed back with crystal clarity. I was 22 years old, and I had just secured a highly competitive paid internship at a prestigious accounting firm in downtown Atlanta. It was the first real step in my career, and I was incredibly proud of myself. Brianna was pledging a top-tier sorority that same semester, and she demanded that I give her my entire first paycheck so she could buy a designer handbag to impress the older sisters. When I flatly refused to hand over the money I had worked 80 hours a week to earn, my parents were furious. They told me I was being selfish and unsupportive of my sister's social future. When I still refused to hand over the cash, my father actually picked up the phone and called the managing director of my internship program. Derek spun a vicious lie, claiming that I had been caught stealing petty cash from his car dealership and that he felt morally obligated to warn the firm about my lack of integrity. I was terminated by the end of the day. My father had destroyed my first major career opportunity without a single ounce of hesitation, simply because I would not fund Brianna's shallow vanity. He thought that same threat would terrify me now. He thought I was still that scared 22-year-old girl desperate for her parents' approval and terrified of losing her job. He did not understand that I was no longer an intern. I was a senior forensic auditor with millions of dollars sitting in offshore accounts and direct lines to federal task forces. My career was entirely bulletproof. My sleek black car pulled smoothly up to the curb, the tires crunching softly against the gravel. The driver immediately stepped out and hurried around the vehicle to open the rear passenger door for me. I did not argue with my father. I did not raise my voice or try to explain the massive legal avalanche that was currently hurtling toward him. I simply adjusted my grip on my heavy metal cane and turned toward the waiting car. I paused just before stepping into the luxurious leather interior and looked back over my shoulder at my parents. They were standing on the stone portico, looking smug and victorious, thinking their cruel threats had successfully cowed me into submission. "Go ahead and make the call, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any emotion. "Call my firm. But you might want to turn on the local and federal news tomorrow morning before you bother putting on your tuxedo for the wedding." I did not wait to see the confusion settle over their faces. I slid into the back of the car, and the driver closed the heavy door, sealing out the humid air and the toxic presence of my family. As the car pulled away from the country club and headed toward the glittering lights of downtown Atlanta, I leaned my head back against the soft leather seat. The trap had officially been sprung, and by sunrise there would be absolutely nothing left of the Sterling family empire or my parents' carefully crafted social facade. The ride back to my penthouse was a blur of neon city lights and the gentle hum of the engine. I slept for a few hours, but by dawn I was fully awake and dressed in my most severe charcoal business suit. The heavy back brace was concealed beneath a structured blazer. I stood at the kitchen island, staring out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the morning fog rolling over the Atlanta skyline. It was exactly 24 hours before Brianna and Preston were scheduled to walk down the aisle. My buzzer rang precisely at 7 in the morning. I pressed the security release, and a few moments later, 3 federal agents stepped into my living room. They were dressed in dark suits carrying heavy metal briefcases and encrypted laptops. Special Agent Miller took the lead, setting his equipment down on my massive marble dining table. He was a tall, stern man who had been my primary contact at the Financial Crimes Division for the past 6 months. He did not offer small talk or pleasantries. He knew exactly what was at stake. The dining table quickly transformed into a war room. Digital files and printed bank ledgers covered the marble surface. I leaned my cane against the wall and pulled up a stool, ignoring the familiar ache in my lower spine. We had Preston full audio confession from the country club hallway, but a confession was only the beginning. We needed the paper trail to make the federal charges stick securely. Agent Miller brought up a wire transfer log on his screen. He pointed to a specific sequence of numbers. "Here is the problem, Sydney," he said, keeping his voice low. "Local fraud is a state issue. We need to tie the sale of your condo directly to federal statutes to bring the hammer down on the Sterling family." I nodded, pulling a printed folder toward him. "I already did," I replied, tracing my finger over the highlighted transactions. Preston did not just take the money from the fraudulent sale and cash it out at a local bank. He funneled it through an interstate wire transfer to a shell company in Delaware before moving it to the wedding vendors in Georgia and his creditors in Macau. The moment the funds crossed state lines, it became federal wire fraud, I explained, leaning closer to the documents. But it gets much worse than a single stolen condo. I opened a second folder, spreading out a complex web of corporate structures and dummy corporations. I had been building this map for weeks, tracing every single dollar associated with the Sterling family name. Preston is not just a desperate guy with a gambling problem. His entire family is a massive fraud. The agents leaned in, studying the intricate web of transfers I had mapped out. "Eleanor Sterling likes to brag about their legacy wealth," I continued, sliding a bank statement toward Agent Miller. "But there is no legacy. They have been running a mid-level Ponzi scheme through their private investment firm for the last 15 years. They target new money families desperate for social validation, just like my parents. They promise exclusive returns and high society access, but they use new investments to pay off the old ones and fund their lavish lifestyle." Agent Miller traced the lines connecting the fake accounts. "So they ran out of new investors," he stated flatly. "Exactly," I said, staring at the damning numbers. Preston was broke. He owed millions to illegal syndicates offshore. When his father investment firm started running out of new victims, they could not cover Preston debts anymore. That was why he targeted Brianna. He saw how desperate my parents were for validation. He knew they had a daughter with a pristine high-value real estate asset. He manipulated them into stealing my condo because it was the only way to get a quick, massive infusion of clean cash to keep the syndicates from breaking his legs. I pointed to a series of offshore transfers. My parents thought they were helping out a wealthy family with a temporary cash flow issue. They thought forging my name was the price of admission into high society. They did not realize they were funding their own daughter wedding with stolen money while simultaneously paying off violent international criminals. I had spent countless sleepless nights sitting at this exact table, pushing through nerve pain that made my vision blur. While Brianna was busy picking out imported white roses and tasting custom wedding cakes, I was digging through public tax filings and cross-referencing offshore shell companies. I tracked the wire transfers that paid for the string quartet and the ice sculptures and the 5-tier cake. Every single extravagant detail of my sister perfect day was paid for by the equity I had spent my entire adult life building. The sheer audacity of their greed was almost impressive. My parents were so blinded by the shiny veneer of the Sterling name that they never bothered to look beneath the surface. If my father had spent 5 minutes applying the same scrutiny to Preston that he applied to my career choices, he would have seen the glaring red flags. But Derek and Yvonne did not want the truth. They wanted a fairy tale. They wanted to rub elbows with the elite. And they were perfectly fine sacrificing my sanctuary to get there. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the laptops and the rustling of paper. Agent Miller clicked through the digital files verifying every single account number and routing code I had provided. "You tracked all of this while recovering from spinal surgery?" he asked, without looking up from his screen. "I did not have a choice," I replied, keeping my voice flat. They tried to erase my existence. They thought because I was in a hospital bed I was an easy target. My mother and father were willing to leave me homeless and broken just to buy their way into a country club. They forgot what I do for a living. I handed him the last stack of papers. "These are the final ledgers. It shows the exact path of the money from the illegal sale of my property through the Delaware Dummy Corporation directly into the catering, floral, and venue accounts for the wedding tomorrow. The entire event is funded by federal wire fraud and laundered money. My parents signed the fake power of attorney, but Preston executed the financial transfers across state borders. He tied the noose around his own neck. I watched the agents cross-reference my findings with their own federal databases. The verification process took hours, but I sat perfectly still. The physical pain in my back was entirely secondary to the profound sense of cold closure settling over me. All the years of my parents comparing me to Brianna, all the moments they made me feel like an ugly, unwanted burden, were finally culminating in this exact room. They had built their entire identity on the illusion of prestige, and now that illusion was going to destroy them. Agent Miller picked up a heavy black pen. He reviewed the final page, checking the timestamp on the audio file of Preston confession from the night before. He read through the wire transfer logs one last time, ensuring every piece of evidence was locked tight. The air in the penthouse felt thick and charged with anticipation. The trap I had spent weeks building was finally complete, and there was no way out for any of them. Agent Miller uncapped his pen. He signed his name across the bottom of the federal warrant, authorizing the immediate seizure of assets and the arrest of Preston Sterling. He closed the folder and looked up at me, his expression completely serious. "We move in tomorrow," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "Right when he says I do." The morning sun broke over the Atlanta skyline, casting a warm golden glow over the sprawling historic estate where the bridal party was getting ready. Brianna sat dead center in the lavish master suite, wrapped tightly in a white silk robe with the word bride embroidered across the back in heavy gold thread. A dedicated team of hired makeup artists and hairstylists buzzed around her like worker bees tending to their demanding queen. She was holding her phone out at arm length, recording yet another live video for her thousands of social media followers. She pouted her glossy lips and intentionally angled her hand to show off the massive emerald-cut engagement ring that was secretly paid for with my stolen equity. She bragged to the camera lens about how her wedding was guaranteed to be the most exclusive social event of the season, and how she was officially marrying into true Southern royalty. She did not care for a single second that her older sister was not in the room celebrating with her. She only cared about the manufactured aesthetic of extreme wealth she was projecting to complete strangers online. My mother Yvonne hovered anxiously in the background, pouring expensive mimosas and adjusting the window blinds to make sure the natural lighting hit Brianna's face perfectly for the video. They were both completely intoxicated by their own illusions, absolutely oblivious to the massive federal dragnet closing tightly around them. The flawless illusion of their perfect morning began to fracture precisely at 10 o'clock. A sharp, frantic knock echoed through the heavy wooden door of the bridal suite, and the head wedding planner burst into the room without waiting for permission. Her face was completely pale and her clipboard was shaking visibly against her chest. She completely ignored the live video Brianna was filming and walked straight up to my mother. She tried to keep her voice low, but the raw panic in her tone carried easily across the quiet room. The lead floral designer had just arrived at the venue and he was absolutely refusing to unload a single imported white rose. The final payment for $15,000 had bounced hard. The bank had flagged the account for suspicious activity and immediately reversed the wire transfer that Preston had initiated the day before. Brianna dropped her phone onto the mirrored vanity, her perfect camera-ready smile dissolving instantly into a twisted mask of ugly confusion. She demanded to know what was going on and why her flowers were being held hostage. My mother immediately went into desperate damage control mode, insisting to the planner that it was just a simple banking error and promising frantically to clear it up right away. Yvonne rushed out into the grand hallway, clutching her phone with trembling fingers. She tried calling Preston, but his phone went straight to an automated voicemail message. She tried calling my father Derek, but he was already dealing with a massive catering crisis downstairs because their final food and beverage payment had also been rejected by the payment processor. True panic was setting in, deep and fast. The entire Sterling family fortune was suddenly inaccessible. Every single credit card they tried to use was declining. Every joint checking and savings account was frozen solid. Yvonne knew there was only one person in her orbit who had the financial knowledge and the technical access to cause this level of catastrophic banking failure. She dialed my number. I was sitting quietly at my kitchen island drinking black coffee when my phone buzzed violently on the cold marble counter. The screen lit up bright with my mother's name. I did not answer it. I simply watched the glowing screen eventually go dark and waited patiently for the voicemail notification icon to appear. I tapped play and let the audio fill the quiet, empty space of my penthouse. Yvonne's voice sounded incredibly small and desperate, stripped of all the haughty country club arrogance she usually directed at me. "Sydney, please pick up the phone," she begged, her voice cracking loudly with unshed tears. "The florist is threatening to leave, and the caterers are literally packing up their trucks right now. Preston bank accounts are frozen solid, and your father credit cards are declining everywhere we try to use them. I know you are angry about the condo situation, but you cannot do this today. You cannot ruin your sister's wedding over a silly misunderstanding. Please, Sydney, I am begging you as your mother. Just unfreeze the bank accounts for today. Let us get through the church ceremony and the reception, and we can figure out the money tomorrow, I swear. You know exactly how fragile Brianna is. Remember when you stubbornly refused to give her your paycheck for her sorority dues, and she cried in her room for an entire week because she felt so left out? Your father had to call your boss just to protect her mental health. You cannot break her heart again on her special day. Just fix the accounts right now, and we will make it up to you later. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her voicemail was staggering to listen to. She actually believed I had simply hacked a retail banking portal to throw a petty sibling tantrum. She thought freezing federal assets tied to international money laundering was something I could just magically undo with a click of a button, like I was resetting a forgotten password. And even now, as her entire fake world was actively collapsing around her, she was still trying to weaponize Brianna's supposed fragile emotions to manipulate me into submission. She brought up the sorority dues incident without a single ounce of irony or guilt, completely ignoring the brutal fact that my father had intentionally destroyed my first major career internship over that exact same demand. They still viewed me as nothing more than a convenient disposable bank account waiting to be drained to fund my sister's shallow, useless life. I reached out and permanently deleted the voicemail. The silence in the penthouse returned heavy and final. There would be absolutely no more saving them from their own greed. I pushed myself up from the island stool, using my heavy metal cane to carefully steady my healing spine. It was time to get dressed for a wedding. I bypassed the elegant emerald green gown I had worn to the country club confrontation the night before. Instead, I reached into the very back of my dark closet and pulled out a custom-tailored crimson-red suit. It was a bold, aggressive, and unapologetic color that completely violated every known traditional rule of polite Southern wedding etiquette. It was decidedly not the outfit of a quiet, supportive older sister blending into the background. It was the precise uniform of a woman who was arriving to execute a hostile corporate takeover. I carefully stepped into the perfectly tailored trousers and slipped on the structured blazer, adjusting the expensive fabric over my rigid medical back brace. The vibrant red silk contrasted sharply against my dark skin, making me look powerful, dangerous, and entirely untouchable. I checked my reflection one last time in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. There were no tears left to cry for these people, and no apologies left to give. I grabbed my cane and my matching clutch, checking quickly to ensure my federal identification badge was securely tucked inside the pocket. My phone buzzed again on the counter with another frantic text message from my father demanding I answer him immediately and fix the mess I created. I did not bother reading the rest of his empty, desperate threats. I simply turned off the lights, got into the private elevator, and rode down to the lobby, where my chauffeured car was already waiting with the engine running. I settled deep into the plush back seat and looked out the tinted window as the driver pulled smoothly out into the busy morning traffic. "Go ahead, Dad. I whispered softly to the empty car. But you better check the news tomorrow morning before you put on your tuxedo. The drive to the country club chapel was a quiet stretch of smooth asphalt beneath the tires of my private car. I watched the lush green canopy of the Atlanta suburbs pass by my reflection in the tinted glass, showing a woman clad in brilliant crimson red. The color was a calculated strike, a visual manifestation of every warning they had chosen to ignore. It felt like wearing a suit of armor designed to completely reject the quiet, submissive role my family had forced upon me for my entire life. When we pulled up to the grand entrance of the Buckhead Chapel, the sheer scale of the Sterling family desperation was on full display in the morning light. The massive floral arches spanning the heavy wooden doorway were only half finished. A glaring sign that the florists had indeed stopped working the moment Preston's final wire transfer bounced. Guests in pastel silks and dark tuxedos milled around the courtyard, casting confused, anxious glances at the frantic event staff rushing back and forth with panicked expressions. The chauffeur opened my door and I stepped out, planting my heavy metal cane firmly on the cobblestone driveway. The morning sun caught the rich, vibrant fabric of my suit, and the effect on the crowd was immediate. Heads turned rapidly. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, leaving a heavy, awkward silence in the humid air. A sea of wealthy socialites paused to stare at the woman boldly defying every unspoken rule of Southern wedding etiquette. I kept my posture perfectly rigid, ignoring the dull throbbing in my fused spine that threatened to slow my pace. I walked slowly toward the heavy oak doors of the chapel, letting the silence of the crowd amplify the rhythmic clicking of my cane against the stone. I was not there to hide in the shadows or keep the peace. I was there to be the storm they never saw coming. As I reached the top of the stone steps, a wall of pale pink silk suddenly blocked my path. Brianna 4. Bridesmaids moved in unison, stepping in front of the double doors like a barricade of spray tans and forced smiles. Standing dead center was Courtney Vance, Brianna, childhood best friend and chief enabler. Courtney crossed her arms over her chest, looking me up and down with the exact same sneer she had perfected when we were teenagers. "You cannot go in there, Sydney," Courtney said, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. "Brianna explicitly told us to keep you out if you decided to show up and cause a scene. And you absolutely cannot wear a bright red suit to a wedding. You are just trying to ruin her perfect day because you are jealous and bitter." I stopped and leaned my weight onto my cane, studying Courtney and the other three women standing beside her like loyal foot soldiers. They were the exact same girls who used to corner me in the high school locker room, mocking my clearance rack clothes and knocking my heavy textbooks onto the floor, while Brianna stood in the background laughing and filming it on her phone. They used to call me the charity case of the family, the boring older sister who would never amount to anything more than a glorified calculator. They had spent their entire teenage years treating me like dirt just to earn Brianna approval and secure their spot in her shallow inner circle. I let out a soft laugh that made Courtney flinch defensively. "I am not 16 anymore, Courtney," I said, my voice low and dangerously calm. "And you are not the queen of the high school cafeteria. You are a 30-year-old woman whose credit cards are currently maxed out paying for that pale pink dress. Because your husband quietly filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy last Tuesday." The color drained from Courtney's face so fast she looked like she might physically collapse onto the stone steps. The other bridesmaids gasped, stepping away from her instinctively. I shifted my cold gaze to the girl on Courtney's left. "And you, Ashley," I continued smoothly, "should probably be checking your joint checking account instead of guarding a door for someone who does not actually care about you. The IRS placed a federal lien on your accounts early this morning. It is truly amazing what a senior forensic auditor can learn when reviewing federal tax flags for associate wire fraud." I did not have to say another word. The wall of pink silk crumbled instantly as the women scrambled to grab their phones from their matching clutch purses, their faces masked in pure, unadulterated panic. I walked right through the gap they left, stepping into the cool, dim interior of the chapel without a single person daring to lay a hand on my red suit. The interior of the church was heavily scented with imported lilies and suffocating tension. The pews were packed with hundreds of guests, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the chaotic energy radiating from the prep rooms. Whispers followed me like a wave as I made my slow, deliberate way down the side aisle. The crimson red of my suit was a beacon in the sea of muted wedding colors, drawing every eye in the massive room. I did not bother looking for my parents or Preston mother. I knew they were likely hiding in the back offices, desperately trying to hold the crumbling pieces of their fake empire together long enough to get the marriage certificate signed. I bypassed the reserved family seating entirely, leaving the front rows empty. Instead, I slid into the very back row, settling onto the polished wooden bench. I rested my hands on the top of my cane, keeping my back perfectly straight against my medical brace. I had the perfect vantage point to watch the entire spectacle unfold from the shadows. The heavy, anxious silence in the chapel was suddenly broken by the deep, resonant chord of the pipe organ. The guests stood up in unison, turning their attention toward the back of the room. The massive oak doors swung wide open, and the traditional wedding march began to play, filling the high, vaulted ceilings. My parents stepped into the doorway, flanking Brianna. She looked like a magazine cover draped in thousands of dollars of custom white lace and imported silk. My father had a tight, fake smile plastered across his sweating face, while my mother gripped her bouquet so hard her knuckles were white. As they began their slow walk down the long, carpeted aisle, Brianna turned her head and caught my eye, sitting alone in the back row. Her lips curled into a smug, victorious smile, thinking her threats had forced me to sit in the back like a banished relative. She thought she had won. She thought the bounced checks and the frantic morning phone calls were just minor glitches she had successfully ignored to get her perfect moment. She reached the altar and took Preston's trembling, sweaty hand, turning to face the pastor. The music faded into a reverent, heavy silence. The pastor opened his leather-bound book, taking a deep breath. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice echoing through the massive, silent space. "We are gathered here today." The drive to the lavish country club was a quiet blur of lush green trees and perfectly manicured lawns. My chauffeured car pulled up to the grand entrance, and the driver quickly opened my door. I stepped out, planting my heavy metal cane firmly on the pristine cobblestone driveway. The bright morning sun hit the rich fabric of my custom-tailored crimson-red suit, and the effect on the milling crowd was instantaneous. Guests in pale pastels and dark traditional tuxedos stopped mid-sentence, their heads turning rapidly to stare at the woman, boldly violating every known rule of wedding etiquette. I ignored their shocked whispers and kept my posture perfectly rigid, masking the dull ache in my healing spine. I walked slowly toward the chapel entrance, letting the rhythmic click of my cane announce my arrival. As I reached the top of the stone steps, a wall of pale pink silk suddenly blocked my path. Brianna. 4 bridesmaids moved in perfect unison, stepping in front of the heavy wooden doors like a barricade. Standing dead center was Courtney Vance. Brianna, childhood best friend and chief enabler. Courtney crossed her arms over her chest, looking me up and down with the exact same sneer she had perfected when we were teenagers. "You cannot go in there, Sydney," Courtney said, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. "Brianna explicitly told us to keep you out if you tried to show up and cause a scene. You cannot wear a bright red suit to a wedding. You are just trying to ruin her perfect day because you are bitter and jealous." I stopped and leaned my weight onto my cane, studying Courtney and the other 3 women. They were the exact same girls who used to corner me in the high school locker room, mocking my clothes and knocking my textbooks onto the floor, while Brianna stood in the background laughing and filming it. They had spent their entire teenage years treating me like garbage just to earn my sister approval. I let out a soft laugh that made Courtney flinch defensively. "I am not 16 anymore, Courtney," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "And you are not the queen of the cafeteria. You are a 30-year-old woman whose credit cards are currently maxed out paying for that bridesmaid dress because your husband quietly filed for bankruptcy last Tuesday. The color drained from Courtney's face so fast she looked ill. I shifted my cold gaze to the girl on her left. And you, Ashley, should probably be checking your joint accounts instead of guarding a door for someone who does not actually care about you. The IRS placed a federal lien on your business early this morning. It is truly amazing what a senior forensic auditor can learn when reviewing federal tax flags. The wall of pink silk crumbled instantly as the women scrambled for their phones, their faces masked in pure panic. I walked right through the gap they left, stepping into the cool, dim interior of the chapel. I bypassed the reserved family seating entirely, leaving the front rows empty. Instead, I slid into the very back row, settling onto the polished wooden bench. I rested my hands on my cane, waiting patiently in the shadows. A few moments later, the heavy, anxious silence in the chapel was broken by the deep, resonant chord of the pipe organ. The guests stood up, turning their attention toward the back of the room. Brianna walked down the aisle, looking like a magazine cover draped in custom white lace and imported silk. My father walked beside her with a tight, fake smile plastered across his sweating face. As they moved down the long, carpeted aisle, Brianna turned her head and caught my eye, sitting alone in the back row. Her lips curled into a smug, victorious smile, thinking her threats had forced me into submission. She reached the altar and took Preston's trembling, sweaty hand, turning to face the pastor. The pastor opened his leather-bound book. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice echoing through the massive, silent space. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Brianna and Preston." The traditional vows dragged on every word, feeling like a hollow mockery, considering the groom had funded this spectacle with stolen equity and offshore syndicate money. Brianna soaked up every syllable, totally oblivious to the reality that her fairy tale was built on federal wire fraud. Then the pastor reached the moment everyone knows from the movies. He looked out over the congregation of wealthy socialites and business partners. "If anyone objects to this union," he asked, clearly, "speak now or forever hold your peace." The entire congregation seemed to hold its collective breath. Hundreds of heads turned, slightly shifting their gaze toward the back row, where the banished older sister in the bright red suit sat alone. They fully expected me to stand up and cause a dramatic scene. Brianna glared at me over her shoulder, her eyes daring me to ruin her moment. But I did not say a single word. I did not stand up or shout. Instead, I calmly reached into my clutch and pulled out a sleek silver flask. I casually unscrewed the cap, raised it to my lips, and took a slow, deliberate sip of bourbon. I let the silence stretch out. I watched the relief wash over my mother's face. I watched Brianna smirk, return confident that she had finally beaten me. The pastor smiled and opened his mouth to continue the ceremony. He never got the chance. The heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel burst inward with a violent crash that shook the stained glass windows. The sound echoed loudly through the serene space. Nobody screamed right away, because the shock was too absolute. Everyone turned around expecting to see a dramatic lover bursting in to stop the wedding. But it was not a movie, and there was no romantic rival waiting in the doorway. Standing in the entrance, framed by the bright afternoon sunlight, were 5 federal agents. They were wearing dark tactical windbreakers, with bold yellow letters across the back and heavy utility belts. Special Agent Miller stood at the center, holding a thick stack of manila folders and a federal warrant. The reality of a highly coordinated government raid crashing a high-society country club wedding sent a shockwave of pure terror through the pews. Wealthy investors and socialites scrambled to pull their feet out of the aisle, muttering in panicked whispers. Agent Miller did not hesitate. He and his team marched straight down the center aisle, their heavy boots thudding rhythmically against the pristine white carpet. The soft pastel florals and delicate lace of the wedding party clashed violently with the cold, hard authority of federal law enforcement. I sat back and took another small sip from my flask, watching the dominoes I had carefully stacked finally begin to fall. They thought white-collar crime could be brushed under the rug with a fake power of attorney and a forced smile. Brianna lost her mind completely. Her carefully constructed composure shattered into a million pieces. She dropped her expensive bouquet, scattering white orchids across the marble altar. Her face twisted into a mask of furious disbelief as she realized her perfect high society wedding was turning into a crime scene. She took a step toward the advancing agents, her heavy silk gown rustling loudly. "You cannot be here!" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceilings. "You are ruining my wedding! Get out of my church right now!" She pointed a manicured finger at Agent Miller, screaming and demanding that someone call security. She still thought her bridal status somehow granted her diplomatic immunity from federal law. But the agents did not even look at her. They completely ignored the screaming bride, parting around her like water flowing around a stone. They walked right past Brianna's stunned, furious face and went straight for the groom. Preston did not even try to run. His knees simply gave out as two agents grabbed his arms, twisting them firmly behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut over his wrists echoed loudly through the silent, horrified chapel. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut over Preston's wrists sent a physical shockwave through the room. Brianna stopped screaming, her mouth hanging open in a silent, perfect round expression of pure horror as the two federal agents hauled her brand-new husband back to his feet. His expensive tailored tuxedo jacket bunched up awkwardly around his shoulders, making him look suddenly very small. Stripped of his arrogant country club posture and his borrowed confidence, he was just a desperate man drowning in his own lies. The massive imported floral arrangements framing the altar seemed to mock the absolute destruction happening beneath them. The sweet smell of the lilies mixed with the sour scent of panic. Down in the front row, Preston's parents finally snapped out of their paralyzed shock. Eleanor Sterling dropping her carefully cultivated facade of untouchable old money. Grace grabbed her husband Arthur by the arm. They did not rush to the altar to help their son. They did not demand answers from the agents or call out for their high-powered attorneys like wealthy people usually do. Instead, they instinctively turned their backs on Preston and bolted for the side exit of the chapel. They moved with the desperate, frantic energy of seasoned grifters who knew exactly what a federal raid looked like and wanted to put as much distance between themselves and the handcuffs as possible. They abandoned their only son without a single backward glance. They almost made it to the heavy arched wooden door near the choir loft, but Special Agent Miller had planned for every contingency in this operation. Before Arthur could even reach for the brass handle, the door swung open from the outside. 3 more agents in tactical windbreakers stepped into the aisle, blocking their escape route entirely. Eleanor stumbled backward, her expensive fascinator slipping sideways on her perfectly styled hair. Arthur Sterling, the man my father had practically worshipped as a pinnacle of business success, threw up his hands in immediate cowardice. There was no dignity left in his posture. He looked exactly like the cornered fraudster I had mapped out on my kitchen island. An agent stepped forward and efficiently read them their rights, citing the massive 15-year Ponzi scheme they had been running through their private investment firm. The whispers in the chapel escalated into a deafening roar of scandalized gasps. The wealthy guests, the very people my parents had sacrificed everything to impress, were now pulling out their phones to record the high society collapse of the decade. The country club elite were watching their own investments evaporate as Arthur and Eleanor were pushed against the wall to be searched. Up at the altar, Preston began to completely fall apart. The reality of the federal charges was finally penetrating his thick skull. He looked wildly around the chapel, his eyes darting from his arrested parents to the federal agents securing his arms. He was sweating profusely, the heavy droplets ruining his perfectly styled hair and staining his crisp white collar. He looked at Brianna, who was staring at him like he had grown a second head. "Help me," he pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Do something, tell them to stop." But Brianna just backed away, clutching her ruined custom white silk dress as if she could protect herself from the contagion of his guilt. Then Preston's frantic eyes found my parents. Derek and Yvonne were standing frozen at the edge of the altar stairs. Their entire world was disintegrating right in front of their eyes. Derek took a tentative step forward, raising his hands in a placating gesture, as if he could somehow negotiate a business deal with the federal government to make it all go away. Preston, my boy Derek started, his voice trembling with a pathetic mixture of confusion and misplaced loyalty. We will get this sorted out right now. We will call our lawyers and fix this misunderstanding. But Preston did not want his father-in-law help. He wanted a scapegoat. The moment Derek spoke, Preston's face twisted into a mask of ugly, desperate survival. He violently yanked his shoulder, trying to pull away from the agents grasping him. I did not do it, he screamed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings and shattering whatever dignity remained in the room. I did not steal any property. It was him. Preston thrust his chin aggressively in my father's direction. It was Derek. He is the one who forged the documents. He sold me the house. I am the victim here. He lied to me about the equity to pay for this wedding. The entire congregation went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop in the massive chapel. Preston, the man who had supposedly rescued my family from their middle-class obscurity, the man who had promised them exclusive access to a world of generational wealth, was now pointing the finger directly at the black father-in-law who had worshipped the ground he walked on. Preston did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He did not care about the wedding or the vows he had just been preparing to take. He only cared about saving his own skin, and he was perfectly willing to feed my parents to the federal wolves to do it. The deep-seated racial and class dynamics were impossible to ignore in that moment. The white son-in-law they had placed on a pedestal was using them as a human shield without a shred of remorse. He manipulated me, Preston continued, sobbing loudly, now the tears streaming down his flushed face. He told me his older daughter was mentally unstable and gave him full power of attorney. He said the money was completely clean. I just wanted to marry his daughter. He set me up. He orchestrated the entire wire fraud because he was desperate for cash. I sat in the very back row, leaning heavily against my cane, and watched the absolute devastation wash over my parents' faces. It was a physical blow. Derek staggered backward as if Preston had actually struck him in the chest. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Yvonne clutched her heart, her eyes wide with a horrific realization that was finally breaking through her delusions. They had stolen my home. They had forged my signature. They had thrown their own flesh and blood to the wolves, believing that this wealthy savior was going to elevate their social status and give them the life they felt they deserved. They had sacrificed their firstborn child for a seat at a table that did not even exist. And now the very man they had traded my life for was standing at the altar, looking them dead in the eye and casually handing them over to federal prison. The absolute totality of his betrayal hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The shiny, perfect facade they had murdered my future to protect was entirely gone, revealing the ugly, pathetic truth beneath. Derek and Yvonne stood there, completely stripped of their arrogance, looking at the monster they had invited into their home, while the agents holding the handcuffs turned their attention toward them. The paralyzing silence that had gripped the chapel shattered into a deafening roar of scandalized whispers and frantic murmurs. Hundreds of wealthy guests, the absolute elite of Atlanta society, recoiled in their polished mahogany pews as if the air itself had become toxic. Church elders, men and women, my parents had spent the last decade aggressively courting, for social validation, stared down at the altar with undisguised contempt. Derek and Yvonne stood frozen under the heavy, judgmental gaze of the very people they had sold their souls to impress. The illusion of their dignified country club life was bleeding out onto the pristine white aisle runner right next to Brianna's abandoned floral bouquet. I watched from the shadows of the back row as my father tried to wave his hands in a frantic, pacifying gesture, attempting to calm the storm that was actively destroying his reputation. He turned to the senior pastor, a man who had regularly dined at our house, and tried to force a reassuring laugh. "It is just a massive misunderstanding," Derek stammered loudly, his voice cracking as it echoed off the high vaulted ceiling. "My son-in-law is just confused and under a lot of stress with the wedding preparations. We are respectable people. You all know us. You know my business. Please just give us a moment to clear this up with the authorities." But no one was listening to him. The elite country club members began gathering their designer coats and clutching their expensive purses, practically climbing over each other to distance themselves from the Sterling family and my parents. The wealthy socialites who had just yesterday kissed my mother cheek were now pulling their children away and rushing toward the heavy wooden doors. Yvonne's face had completely lost its carefully applied color, leaving her looking hollow and aged. She looked around wildly, her eyes darting from the federal agents securing Preston to the disgusted faces of the bridesmaids who had just abandoned Brianna at the altar. The brutal reality of their social execution was finally setting in deep into her bones. They were no longer the proud parents of a beautiful bride marrying into legacy wealth. They were accused criminals being exposed in the house of God, surrounded by federal law enforcement. Their entire identity was tied to how these country club members perceived them, and now they were nothing more than a cautionary tale. And in their absolute desperation, as their entire universe collapsed into a federal crime scene, they did the only thing they knew how to do when their lives fell apart. They looked for me. My mother's eyes locked onto my bright crimson-red suit at the back of the chapel. A twisted, pathetic kind of relief washed over her panicked face. She actually believed that even now, after everything they had done to me, I would step in and fix it. She genuinely thought I would use my professional credentials to somehow explain away the wire fraud and save them from public ruin. "Sydney!" She called out, her voice shrill and desperate, cutting through the chaotic noise of the fleeing guests. "Sydney, please come up here and tell these officers there has been a mistake. Tell them you gave us permission to manage the condo for the wedding. Tell them we are a good family. You know how to talk to these people, Sydney, just fix this." I did not say a word at first. I simply gripped the handle of my heavy metal cane and stepped out from the back pew. The remaining guests parted like the Red Sea as I began my slow, deliberate walk down the center aisle. The rhythmic clicking of my cane against the marble floor served as the only metronome for their impending doom. I did not rush. I forced them to wait in the agonizing tension while I closed the distance between us. With every step I took, I shed another layer of the obedient, silent daughter they had tried to force me to be. I looked at Brianna, who was shivering in her expensive white gown, weeping as her fairy tale burned to the ground. She had spent her whole life making me feel small, and now she was entirely powerless. When I finally reached the carpeted steps of the altar, I stopped. I looked at Preston, who was currently weeping openly in federal handcuffs, refusing to make eye contact with the family he had just betrayed. Then I looked directly at my parents. They were trembling violently, leaning toward me, expecting me to save them, to throw myself under the bus one last time, to protect their precious, fragile reputation. They were waiting for me to be the loyal shield they could hide behind. "You sold my home while I was under anesthesia to buy a seat at a table with racists and con artists," I said, my voice perfectly level, carrying clearly across the emptying room. "You handed my entire future over to a man who just traded your freedom for a lighter prison sentence without hesitating for a single second. You wanted so desperately to belong to this world of generational wealth that you never stopped to realize they were bleeding you dry. You stole from your own crippled daughter to feed an illusion of grandeur that was always a lie." I tilted my head, staring directly into my mother's terrified eyes, refusing to let her look away from the monster she had become. "How does the food taste, Mom?" Yvonne let out a choked, sobbing gasp, taking a physical step backward, as if my words had struck her directly in the chest. The absolute finality in my voice broke the last string of hope she was clinging to. She finally realized that I was not there to rescue them. I was the one who had brought the federal agents to the chapel doors. Derek opened his mouth to formulate another desperate lie to try and spin the narrative one more time, but he never got the chance. Special Agent Miller stepped smoothly past Preston and positioned himself directly in front of my parents. His expression was entirely devoid of any sympathy or hesitation, representing the cold, hard reality of the justice system they thought they could outsmart. Derek and Yvonne Sterling, Agent Miller, said, his voice projecting absolute federal authority over the ruined wedding ceremony. You two are listed as primary co-conspirators on the forged power of attorney. Hands behind your backs, please. The sharp metallic clatter of two more sets of handcuffs snapping shut echoed like gunshots in the suddenly silent chapel. Derek and Yvonne, my untouchable parents. The pillars of the Atlanta social scene were shoved unceremoniously against the marble altar. My mother let out a high-pitched wail of absolute terror, her designer pearls clattering against the cold stone. My father kept muttering, "Wait, wait, wait," like a broken record, unable to process that his elite golf club connections could not stop a federal indictment. The agents were entirely unbothered by their panic, expertly securing their wrists and reading them their Miranda rights in flat, steady voices. The remaining stragglers in the pews, the ones who had stayed just to witness the carnage, were frantically recording every second of my parents' ultimate humiliation on their phones. I stood there leaning my weight against my metal cane, simply watching the consequences of their greed finally catch up to them. But the spectacle was not quite over. A guttural primal scream ripped through the heavy air, forcing everyone to turn. Brianna, who had been standing frozen in shock, suddenly snapped. The reality that her perfect wedding, her wealthy husband, and her entire social identity had evaporated in less than 5 minutes finally broke her completely. She dropped to her knees on the white aisle runner, her heavy silk gown pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She tore at the delicate lace veil secured to her hair, ruining her expensive updo as she began to sob hysterically. It was not a sad, graceful cry. It was the ugly, entitled tantrum of a spoiled child who had just had her favorite toy taken away. Brianna slammed her fists against the carpeted floor, shrieking at the top of her lungs. "You ruined it!" she screamed, her voice tearing at the seams. She snapped her head up and locked her tear-streaked, furious eyes onto me. "This is all your fault, Sydney. You destroyed my life. You could not stand seeing me happy. You could not handle that Mom and Dad loved me more. You planned this to ruin my perfect day." Her grief rapidly mutated into violent rage. Fueled by blind anger and the humiliation of losing her status in front of the entire country club, Brianna scrambled to her feet. She let out a furious scream and lunged directly at me. Her hands were curled into claws aiming right for my face. The remaining guests gasped, and one of the federal agents turned to intervene, but I did not flinch. I simply planted my cane, shifted my weight to my good leg, and easily sidestepped her clumsy attack. Brianna's momentum carried her straight past me. Her expensive silk heels caught on the edge of the marble steps and she crashed hard into the wooden banister, tangling herself in her own heavy train. She crumpled into a pathetic heap of white fabric and fake tan, sobbing uncontrollably as she tried to untangle herself. I turned slowly and looked down at her. The cold satisfaction radiating through my chest was absolute. "I did not ruin your life, Bree," I said, my voice cutting through her hysterical sobs like a sharp blade. "You did that entirely on your own. You married a man with $2 million in hidden debt because you cared more about securing a premium country club membership than looking at his actual credit score." The entire chapel seemed to lean in to hear the revelation. Brianna stopped sobbing for a fraction of a second, her mouth hanging open in pure shock. I took a step closer, looking down at the sister who had made my childhood a living hell. "You were so desperate to be the envy of your shallow friends that you completely ignored the massive red flags I pointed out to you 6 months ago," I continued mercilessly. "You told me I was just a jealous spinster who did not understand high finance. Well, The senior forensic auditor understands exactly what multiple shell companies and offshore accounts look like. Preston was completely broke when he met you. He was drowning in debt and facing a massive federal audit. He only married into this family because Mom and Dad were stupid enough to forge the power of attorney on my condo to give him the liquid cash he needed to keep the feds at bay. Brianna shook her head wildly, refusing to believe it. No, she gasped, clutching her ruined dress. You are lying. He is an investment banker. He comes from money. I let out a dry, hollow laugh. He comes from a family of con artists. I corrected her, gesturing toward his parents who were still pinned against the wall by the side exit. His firm is a Ponzi scheme. The diamond on your finger was paid for with stolen retirement funds. This entire wedding, this dress, these flowers, the champagne waiting at the reception, it is all funded by wire fraud. You did not marry a billionaire, Brianna. You married a desperate criminal who just threw our parents to the feds to shave a few years off his sentence. She looked over at Preston, who was currently being escorted down the side aisle by 2 agents, his head hanging in total defeat. He did not even look back at her. He just kept walking, leaving her crying on the floor. The illusion she had worshipped her entire life was dead. The golden child of the Sterling family, the girl who had been handed everything on a silver platter while I was treated like an unwanted burden, was finally forced to swallow the bitter taste of reality. My parents watched from the altar, their hands cuffed behind their backs, completely powerless to comfort their favorite daughter. The remaining guests were already rushing out the doors, eager to spread the gossip of the Sterling family collapse. The silence in the chapel grew heavier, broken only by Brianna, pathetic weeping, and the heavy footsteps of the federal agents processing the scene. I adjusted my grip on my cane, feeling a deep, profound sense of closure. 22 years of being the family scapegoat. 22 years of listening to them praise Brianna while ignoring my existence. It was all finally over. They had dug their own graves, and I had simply handed them the shovels. I turned my back on my sister, preparing to walk out of the church and into my new life. But the consequences of their spectacular failure were not quite finished. The heavy wooden doors near the vestibule pushed open, and Natalie, the high-strung luxury wedding planner, marched into the chapel. Her headset was practically falling off, and her face was flushed bright red with extreme panic. She carried a thick clipboard, clutching it to her chest like a shield as she surveyed the absolute disaster zone of the chapel. She saw the federal agents, the scattered flowers, and the handcuffed parents. Then she zeroed in on the weeping bride on the floor. Natalie rushed over her professional composure, completely abandoning her. "Brianna," she said, her voice sharp and frantic, echoing loudly in the quiet church. "Since the feds just seized the groom accounts and the wire transfers bounced, I need to know right now who is paying the $80,000 balance for this reception." The heavy oak doors of the chapel stood wide open, framing the bright afternoon sun like a spotlight on the absolute disaster unfolding inside. The air was thick with the smell of crushed lilies and the sharp metallic tang of panic. The $80,000 question demanded by the furious wedding planner hung over the room, suffocating everyone in its path. Natalie, the planner, stood with her hands planted firmly on her hips, her clipboard shaking slightly as she glared down at Brianna. She did not care about the federal agents or the handcuffs. She only cared about her invoice. Brianna was still sprawled on the floor, her custom white silk gown tangled around her legs like a beautiful, expensive trap. Her heavy makeup was streaked with black mascara, tears running down her cheeks in muddy rivers. She looked frantically toward our parents, but Derek and Yvonne were still pinned against the marble steps of the altar, their hands secured behind their backs. They could not help her. They could not even help themselves. The illusion of the sterling wealth, the endless offshore accounts, and the lavish lifestyle had all evaporated the moment the federal agents walked through the doors. There was no money. There never had been any money. The reality of her situation finally crashed down on Brianna, crushing the last remnants of her bridal fantasy. She let out a guttural, agonizing scream that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of the chapel. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated entitlement being ripped away by force. She scrambled to her knees, ignoring the expensive fabric tearing under her weight. Her eyes, wild and bloodshot, locked onto me, standing calmly near the side exit. The fury in her face was absolute. She blamed me for everything. She always had. "You ruined everything!" she screamed, her voice cracking as she pointed a trembling finger at my red suit. "You destroyed my life. You could not stand to see me happy. You always hated me because Mom and Dad loved me more. You planned this entire thing just to ruin my perfect day because you are nothing but a jealous, bitter cripple, fueled by her own narcissistic rage." Brianna tried to lunge at me. She pushed herself off the ground, her hands curled into claws aiming directly for my face. She wanted to physically tear me apart for exposing the fraud that funded her fake royalty. Several federal agents tensed, preparing to intervene, but they did not need to. I did not flinch or retreat. I simply planted the rubber tip of my heavy metal cane against the marble floor, shifted my weight slightly to the right, and easily sidestepped her clumsy, frantic attack. Brianna. Momentum carried her forward with nothing to stop her. Her expensive silk heels caught on the edge of the thick aisle runner, and she crashed hard into the polished wooden pews. She collapsed back onto the floor, a pathetic, weeping mess of white fabric and shattered dreams. She curled in on herself, sobbing loudly as the remaining guests stared in absolute horror. I turned slowly and looked down at her, feeling nothing but cold, calculated satisfaction. "I did not ruin your life, Bree," I said, my voice cutting through her hysterical cries with surgical precision. "You did that entirely on your own. You married a man with $2 million in hidden debt because you cared more about securing a premium country club membership than looking at his actual credit score. You wanted the status so badly, you never bothered to ask how he was paying for it." Brianna stopped crying for a fraction of a second, her mouth falling open as the numbers registered in her brain. $2 million. She looked over at Preston, who was currently being escorted down the side aisle by two agents, his head hanging in total defeat. He had sold her a fairy tale built on quicksand, and she had eagerly bought every single lie. I took a step closer, ensuring she heard every word. "You were so desperate to be better than me that you married a con artist," I continued mercilessly. "And now you are tied to a federal wire fraud syndicate. The rings, the dress, the venue. It is all evidence. You are not a billionaire wife, Brianna. You are the punchline to the biggest joke in Atlanta society." Natalie, the wedding planner, did not miss a beat. She stepped right over Brianna, ruined train completely, ignoring the emotional devastation. She tapped her pen aggressively against her clipboard. "That is all very tragic," Natalie said, her voice tight with professional rage. "But since the federal government just seized the groom bank accounts and every single wire transfer has bounced, I need to know right now who is paying the $80,000 balance for this reception." Brianna looked up at Natalie, her eyes wide with fresh terror. $80,000. She did not have 80,000 cents to her name. She looked at my parents again, but Derek and Yvonne were currently occupied. Special Agent Miller had walked over to the altar holding a fresh stack of federal warrants. He stood directly in front of Derek and Yvonne, who were visibly trembling. Derek tried to stand tall, attempting to project the image of a respectable businessman, but the handcuffs severely ruined the effect. Yvonne was weeping silently, her carefully constructed world completely obliterated. They had traded their oldest daughter's future for a seat at the table with the elite, and now the table was being confiscated as state evidence. Derek and Yvonne Sterling, Agent Miller said, his voice booming through the quiet chapel, ensuring every remaining guest heard the charges. "You two are listed as primary co-conspirators on the forged power of attorney that illegally liquidated the Buckhead condominium. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and real estate theft. Hands behind your backs, please." The lobby of the luxury hotel had been my temporary sanctuary for exactly 48 hours. 2 days had passed since the spectacular collapse of the Sterling family dynasty at the altar of the community megachurch. The local Atlanta news stations had been running the story non-stop, detailing the federal raids on Preston fraudulent investment firm and the shocking arrest of two prominent country club socialites. My phone had been ringing constantly with calls from distant relatives and former friends who had ignored me for years, suddenly desperate for the inside scoop. I ignored them all. I sat at the heavy mahogany desk in my hotel suite, sipping black coffee and reviewing the legal filings my attorney had prepared. The civil suit to void the fraudulent sale of my condominium and reclaim my property was moving forward swiftly. The evidence was completely irrefutable. My parents had forged my signature while I was sedated in a hospital bed recovering from another surgery on my leg. They had traded my absolute safety for Brianna's expensive floral arrangements. The quiet rhythm of my morning was abruptly shattered by a frantic, heavy pounding on my hotel room door. It was not the polite, sharp knock of housekeeping or room service. It was the desperate rhythm of panic. I set down my coffee mug, gripped the smooth handle of my metal cane, and slowly pulled myself up from the chair. My leg ached a dull, persistent throb, but my mind was completely clear. I walked across the plush carpet, the soft click of my cane grounding me in the present moment. I checked the peephole and felt a cold wave of absolute vindication wash over my chest. Standing in the carpeted hallway looking like two terrified ghosts were Derek and Yvonne. They had clearly just posted bail. They looked absolutely nothing like the polished, arrogant socialites who had paraded down the church aisle just 2 days ago. My father was wearing a rumpled gray sweatshirt, his face unshaven and his eyes bloodshot with dark purple bags hanging underneath them. My mother looked even worse. Her perfectly dyed blonde hair was matted and stringy, clinging to her pale makeup-free face. Her designer clothes had been replaced by cheap, ill-fitting sweatpants. As she shifted her weight, I could clearly see the bulky black federal tracking monitor secured tightly around her left ankle. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open just enough to stand in the frame. I did not step back to let them in. I stood squarely in the center of the doorway, leaning my weight against my cane, forming a physical barricade between my peaceful sanctuary and their chaotic ruin. "Sydney! Please!" My mother sobbed immediately the moment the door opened. She reached out with trembling hands but stopped short when I did not move an inch. "Sydney, you have to help us. You have to call off your lawyers." My father swallowed hard, his voice lacking all of the booming authoritative arrogance he had wielded over me my entire life. "We are out on bail." But the judge froze all of our primary accounts. He pleaded, his eyes darting nervously up and down the empty hotel hallway. "We have absolutely nothing left, Sydney. The country club expelled us. Our friends will not even answer our calls. The only thing keeping us from total destitution is the liquid cash from the condo sale. If your civil suit voids that transaction and the buyers demand their money back, we will not even have enough to pay the retainer for a federal defense attorney." They were literally standing in the hallway of a hotel weeping and begging me to let them keep the money they had stolen from me. They wanted me to sacrifice my home, my independence, and my financial security so they could afford a fancy lawyer to minimize the prison time they earned by committing federal wire fraud. It was the ultimate display of their lifelong narcissism. Even now, standing at the absolute bottom of the pit they had dug, they expected me to throw myself in to cushion their fall. I looked at my mother, who was crying heavily, wiping her nose on the sleeve of her cheap sweatshirt. Then I looked at my father, who was staring at me with desperate, pathetic, pleading eyes. "You spent 31 years treating me like I was a defect," I said, my voice perfectly level and icy cold, echoing slightly in the quiet hallway. 31 years of making me feel like an absolute burden because my physical disability did not fit into your perfect country club image. You shoved me into the background of every family photo. You praised Brianna for breathing while you completely ignored every single one of my academic and professional achievements. You treated me like a broken piece of furniture because I would not play your fake, perfect church games and smile for people who pitied me. "Sydney, that is not true," my mother choked out, crying harder. "We love you. We always loved you." I tightened my grip on my cane, leaning forward slightly, forcing them to step back. "Do not lie to me, Yvonne," I stated flatly, dropping the title of mother completely. "You literally sold my sanctuary to pay for a lie. You waited until I was unconscious under anesthesia, and you forged my signature to steal the only place in the world where I felt safe. You sold the home I bought with my own money just so Brianna could have imported orchids, and you could drink expensive champagne with racists and con artists. Derek raised his hands in a weak, placating gesture. We were going to pay you back. Sydney, I swear to God we were going to put the money back before you ever found out. You just have to drop the civil suit. Please. We are your parents. You cannot just leave us with nothing. You left me with nothing. I reminded him, my expression entirely devoid of mercy. But unlike you, I actually know how to rebuild. I reached into the large front pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a thick, crisp white envelope. My mother let out a small, pathetic gasp of hope, her tear-filled eyes tracking the envelope. She actually thought it was a lifeline. She genuinely believed that after all of the horrific abuse, all of the theft, and all of the betrayal, I had written them a check to save them. She reached out her hands, shaking violently, and took the envelope from my fingers, holding it like it was a holy relic. Open it, I instructed, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. My father leaned in closely as my mother fumbled with the sealed flap. She tore the paper open and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents inside. Her eyes scanned the top page, and the tiny flicker of hope that had illuminated her exhausted face was instantly and permanently extinguished. A fresh sob tore from her throat, and she dropped the papers back into the envelope as if they had burned her fingers. It is not a check, I said, staring down at them with absolute finality. It is the itemized bill for every single hour my legal team has spent untangling your fraudulent sale. And right behind that bill is a formal court-ordered cease and desist. If you ever approach me, contact me, or come near wherever I choose to live again, my lawyers will immediately file harassment charges and have your bail revoked. Sydney. No, my father begged, reaching for the doorframe. You cannot do this. I stepped back into my suite, pulling the heavy wooden door with me. Have a wonderful time in federal court. Derek, I said quietly. I let the door slam shut, locking the deadbolt, the heavy metallic click, echoing like a final judgment, isolating me completely from the toxic ruin of the Sterling family. Forever. The heavy metallic click of the deadbolt locking against my parents was the starting pistol for the absolute dismantling of the Sterling family empire. Over the next 8 months, the federal justice system ground their carefully constructed fantasy into fine dust. It was a slow, public, and agonizingly thorough execution of their social status. I watched it all unfold from the quiet sanctuary of my new home, a beautiful modern townhouse I had purchased with the settlement money recovered from the civil suit. Preston was the first to fall. His high-profile trial lasted barely 3 weeks. The mountain of forensic evidence I had handed over to the IRS left his expensive defense attorneys completely paralyzed. I sat in the back row of the federal courtroom the day the judge handed down a 15-year sentence in a minimum security federal penitentiary. Preston did not look back at the gallery as the marshals led him away. The arrogant smirk he used to wear like a uniform was completely gone, replaced by the hollow stare of a man who finally realized his charm could not manipulate a federal judge. My parents' destruction was less televised, but infinitely more humiliating for them. Derek and Yvonne were hit with massive federal fines and ordered to pay restitution for their part in the wire fraud and real estate theft. The financial bleeding was catastrophic. They were forced to liquidate everything they owned just to stay out of a jail cell. The sprawling Buckhead mansion with its manicured lawns and marble columns was seized and sold at auction. My father luxury cars, my mother designer jewelry collection, even the expensive antique furniture they prized so highly were all auctioned off to pay their mounting legal debts. They filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy a few months later, completely destitute. But the financial ruin was nothing compared to their social execution. The elite megachurch they had spent decades courting immediately completely excommunicated them. The senior pastor released a public statement condemning their actions to protect the church brand. The country club permanently revoked their membership, erasing their names from the donor plaques and banning them from the property. Derek and Yvonne were absolute pariahs forced to rent a tiny two-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood they used to mock. And then there was Brianna, the golden child who had built her entire identity on being superior to everyone else, was suddenly a broke, disgraced social outcast. Without her parents' money or her fraudulent billionaire husband, Brianna had absolutely nothing. Her circle of shallow, wealthy friends dropped her the second the indictments hit the local news. She was toxic to their brand. She tried to maintain the illusion for a few weeks, selling off her remaining designer bags and shoes just to pay for her expensive gym membership and fake tan. But reality eventually caught up with her. She had a useless communications degree she had never actually used and zero professional experience. Her credit was destroyed from the fallout of Preston's seized accounts. She had to swallow her massive pride and actually look for a job to survive, which brought her to the front doors of my forensic accounting firm on a rainy Tuesday morning. She had applied for an entry-level receptionist position under her maiden name, completely unaware that I was now a senior partner at the firm. Or maybe she did know, and she was just that desperate. Either way, when Human Resources flagged her resume and asked if I wanted to handle the interview, given the familiar last name, I immediately cleared my schedule. I watched her through the tinted glass walls of the main conference room. Brianna sat rigidly in a cheap, stiff, gray suit that clearly did not fit her properly. She kept nervously smoothing the fabric, her manicured nails tapping frantically against a cheap plastic folder holding her resume. She looked small, terrified, and entirely out of her element. The arrogance that used to radiate from her pores had been completely extinguished by the harsh reality of the working-class world she used to despise. I gripped my metal cane and pushed open the heavy glass door. The rhythmic clicking of my cane against the hardwood floor caused Brianna to snap her head up. The moment her eyes registered my presence, all the blood drained from her face, leaving her looking completely sickly and pale. I did not say a word as I walked to the head of the long mahogany table. I was wearing a tailored navy blue power suit, my hair perfectly styled, projecting absolute, untouchable authority. I pulled out a leather chair and sat down, placing her thin paper resume on the table in front of me. "Hello, Brianna," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and entirely professional, lacking any trace of sisterly familiarity. "I will be conducting your interview today for the front desk receptionist position." Brianna opened and closed her mouth several times like a fish gasping for air. Her eyes darted around the sleek, expensive conference room, finally landing back on me. "Sydney," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I did not know you worked here. I did not know you were a partner. Please, Sydney, I really need this job. I have exactly $40 left to my name. Mom and Dad cannot help me. Nobody will hire me because of the scandal. You have to help me." I picked up her resume, looking at the mostly blank page. I did not break my professional demeanor for a single second. "I see you have a degree from the state university," I noted calmly, ignoring her desperate pleading. "But there is a significant 6-year gap in your employment history since graduation. Can you explain how you have spent that time and how it prepares you for a demanding corporate environment?" "Sydney, stop it," she begged, leaning forward, her eyes filling with desperate tears. "Please, I am your sister. I have nothing. I will answer the phones. I will get coffee. I will do whatever you want. Just please give me a chance." I set the piece of paper down and folded my hands, resting them on the polished wood. "This firm handles highly sensitive forensic financial data for Fortune 500 companies." I explained, my voice chillingly corporate and detached. "Our receptionists are the first point of contact, and they manage confidential client intake logs. We require our staff to possess an impeccable background and absolute moral clarity." She stared at me, her tears spilling over and running down her cheeks, ruining her cheap makeup. She knew exactly what was coming, and she was entirely powerless to stop it. "Based on your recent association with a massive federal wire fraud syndicate and your well-documented history of entitlement," I continued smoothly, looking directly into her weeping eyes, "I am going to have to pass on your application, Brianna. You simply lack the required integrity for this firm." Brianna let out a choked, humiliating sob, burying her face in her hands, as the reality of her total defeat crushed her. She sat there in the expensive leather chair, crying pathetic, noisy tears. I did not offer her a tissue. I did not offer her comfort. I simply picked up my cane, stood up from the table, and walked toward the glass door. I paused with my hand on the handle, looking back at the sister who used to make me feel so small. "The interview is over," I said quietly. "Please let yourself out. The receptionist will validate your parking." Brianna practically ran out of my office, the heavy glass door swinging shut behind her, taking the last pathetic remnant of my biological family with it. I watched her scurry away toward the elevators, looking like a terrified mouse fleeing a sinking ship. I sat back at my desk and took a deep breath, feeling lighter than I had in my entire life. The justice system moved with agonizing slowness, but it moved with absolute precision. 2 months after the disaster at the chapel, the civil court judge finally slammed his gavel down and completely nullified the fraudulent sale of my Buckhead condominium. The legal paperwork was painfully clear, and the evidence was insurmountable. Derek and Yvonne had forged my signature, and Preston had facilitated the illegal wire transfers to fund his fake empire. The shell company was legally dissolved by the federal authorities, and the property title was rightfully restored to my name. The buyers who had unwittingly purchased stolen property were forced to vacate and seek restitution from Preston's seized offshore accounts. I had my home back and they had absolutely nothing. Walking through the front door of my condo for the first time in months felt like stepping into a stagnant crime scene. The space was exactly as I had left it before my spinal surgery, but the air felt entirely tainted. Every piece of furniture, every rug, every light fixture felt infected by the lingering presence of a man who had smiled in my face while secretly plotting to steal my foundation. I did not even unpack my bags. I immediately hired a premier demolition and remodeling crew, paying them double to start the very next morning. I told the lead contractor to strip the entire place down to the concrete studs. They tore out the dark hardwood floors, ripped down the heavy accent walls, and completely gutted the kitchen and bathrooms. I wanted absolutely nothing remaining that Preston had ever touched or complimented or breathed on. For 3 months, I lived in my corporate hotel suite while my sanctuary was aggressively reborn. I chose warm, rich mahogany floors, brilliant white marble countertops, and massive open glass windows that let the natural sunlight flood into every single corner. The dark, oppressive aesthetic Preston had always preferred was completely erased, painted over with bright, clean whites and soft, calming grays. I was not just renovating a condo, I was reclaiming my entire existence and wiping their betrayal from my physical environment. 6 months after the surgery that was supposed to leave me broken and dependent, I hosted a small, intimate dinner party in my newly restored home. The heavy metal cane that had been my constant companion for months was securely locked away in a dark storage closet. My spine was completely healed, the fused bones stronger than they had ever been. I walked across my new mahogany floors with absolute effortless grace, carrying a large silver tray of roasted vegetables and fresh herbs to the massive dining table. The people sitting around my table tonight were not status-obsessed socialites or fake country club friends judging my outfit. They were the genuine people who had actually shown up for me when my world was collapsing. Marcus, my lead physical therapist, who had patiently pushed me through the agonizing, brutal hours of daily rehabilitation, was sitting at the end of the table, laughing loudly at a joke. Sarah and David, the two senior accountants from my firm, were pouring wine and sharing funny stories about the office. They were the ones who had visited me every single day in the hospital when I was isolated and in pain. They had brought me home cooked meals and fresh flowers when my own mother was too busy planning Brianna's fake royal wedding to even answer my phone calls. This was my real family. A family built on mutual respect and genuine care rather than shallow appearances and toxic, constant competition. The air in the condo was warm and filled with the rich smell of garlic and roasted lamb. There was no underlying tension, No passive-aggressive comments about my weight or my career. No silent, cruel judgments about my physical disability. For the first time in 31 years, I was completely surrounded by people who loved me exactly as I was, without requiring me to change or shrink myself to make them comfortable. We ate and drank and celebrated the simple, beautiful fact of survival. As the evening slowly wound down, and my friends moved to the living room with their coffee and dessert, I stepped out onto the expansive glass balcony to clear my head. The cool night air washed over my face, feeling incredibly refreshing. I leaned against the metal railing, looking out over the glittering Chicago skyline. The city lights stretched out for miles, like a brilliant, endless ocean of possibility. Down below, the streets were alive with movement and energy, but up here, I was entirely at peace. My phone buzzed softly in the pocket of my silk trousers, breaking the quiet moment. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was a voicemail notification from a blocked number. The automated transcription service immediately translated the audio into text scrolling across my screen. It was Yvonne. The transcription read, "Sydney, please, you have to answer me. We are living in a dirty weekly motel. Your father is so sick from the stress. We have absolutely nothing to eat. Please just send us a little money. We are so sorry, we love you. Please call your mother." I stared at the glowing words, reading the absolute desperation of a woman who had willingly traded her oldest daughter's safety for a taste of fake elite luxury. I thought about her standing in a motel room, realizing that her entire life was a lie she could no longer afford to maintain. I felt absolutely nothing for her. No guilt, no lingering anger, no sad pity. The emotional tether had been completely severed. I pressed the small red trash can icon on the screen and deleted the message permanently, without ever listening to the sound of her voice. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and took a deep breath of the crisp, cold city air, feeling the strong, steady alignment of my healed spine supporting my weight perfectly. They thought they could sell my foundation to build their glass house. But they forgot one thing: I am the auditor. I always catch the fraud.